Hello, and welcome to week 7 of social science research methods. We are moving from quantitative methodology to qualitative methodology, and the first method that we're going to talk about is interviewing. Um, I want to say explicitly because we are having guest speakers this week in our discussion section, and please read the article that is on Canvas in week 7 in preparation for their meeting and come prepared to ask questions and talk with them about their research. Um, I bring that up because interviewing and ethnography, while they're two separate forms of methodology, they are also very interconnected. And so you'll see on the syllabus schedule that we're doing interviewing this week and ethnography next week. Our guest speakers may talk about both. I will talk a little bit about both here, and then a bit more when we get into ethnography next week. So let's jump in. Okay, when we talk about interviewing and defining interviewing as a methodological concept, we're essentially talking about all right, so what we end up talking about is meaning making as a part of the um, research process. So, how can we take what they're telling us and help make meaning of the social world? So some advantages of this compared to quantitative data, for example, are that it's personal, right? So survey data you are collecting from another individual and you are not necessarily in front of them or in a position to ask additional questions. So their answers and your interpretation of those answers is limited to the categories that are provided in a given variable. Um, because we have this direct interaction, we can gauge emotional responses, things like sarcasm or humor, much more easily than, again, that you would be able to in a survey. And you can probe and ask follow-up questions. So if the answer makes you think about something, or if you um, want to address something that you've sort of seen in their response that wasn't necessarily in their wording, you can do that in interviews and by extension ethnographies that you cannot do for other for survey data. My apologies. Okay, let's talk about possible interview formats. And this is where ethnography starts to come in a little bit. So there are informal interviews where there's no sort of formalized structure, there's no set of formal questions, it's very conversational, often happens without pre-scheduling. And these types of interviews are generally associated with ethnography because remember, or I shouldn't say remember because we haven't gotten there yet, but ethnography is participant observation. It's going into a community and collecting data by interacting with them on their turf in their communities as an additional member to that community, in which case you're going to want to talk to people. But you're not going to be able to come with your pen and your notepad to take notes because that will change and impact how people behave with you in the setting. The thing about interviewing compared to participant observation, well, I mean, I think that they're very much the same in this way. Um, you don't want to try to take on too much social power by identifying yourself as the scientist. Now, ethically, you should identify yourself as the scientist, and we'll talk about why in a couple of weeks, but you don't want that title to overcome your ability to easily collect data. Okay, the general guide version of an interview is where you have sort of a list of themes that you want to be sure to hit in your conversation with this person. But again, you aren't creating specific questions beforehand, and you're sort of letting the themes guide the conversation. rather than having nothing to guide the conversation and having a lot of structure to guide the conversation, which leads us to the standard open-ended kind of interview. This is the more traditional kind that you are probably familiar with. This requires creating what we call an interview schedule, a list of standard interview questions that you plan to ask every participant. Even in this format, you do still have room for probing, asking follow-up questions, asking additional questions that are not on the list but come up in conversation, eliminating some questions if they seem to make people uncomfortable. But in general, you're trying to follow this particular schedule and set of questions. And then lastly, the closed fixed response kind of interview. These are mostly seen actually on surveys where you will ask a question and then you have a particular set uh, of responses. They're broader, obviously, than surveys, but still limit the participants in their answers. And we don't generally like to use those. Sometimes in experiments as well, they may use closed fixed response interviews. Okay. One of the things that we need to think about as researchers whenever we are in the field, as opposed to just disseminating surveys where we don't have to have an interaction with the participant, is to think about ourselves and how we as individuals may be influencing the data, influencing the people that we're studying, and therefore have to be considered in the analysis of the data and the meaning making of the data. Patricia Hill Collins, who is a Black feminist sociologist, came up with this concept in 1990 called Black feminist thought, and by extension, Black feminist epistemology. And basically, her theory is that white men dominate scientific research, and in social scientific research, most of the communities that are being studied are poor minority communities, uh, communities of color. And if that's the case, then by extension, the data that evolves from that relationship between these white male scientists and the poor people of color that they're studying must be negatively impacted by the distance, the social distance between those identities. Meaning, I'm not going to tell you everything because I don't trust you for a variety of reasons, for structural reasons, for racial reasons, for class-based reasons, for educational reasons, for historical, cultural reasons. But all of that works together to say, I don't trust you, and because I don't trust you, you're only going to get a piece of what I actually think and feel and experience. And Patricia Hill Collins argued that that means that we need more scientists whose identities overlap with those in the communities that they're studying so that we can get deeper, more useful information, and in turn, put that back into the communities in a way that will actually help them. I wrote an article, which you can find on Canvas in the week 7. It's just recommended, it's not required, about this phenomenon in my own dissertation research when I was collecting data almost a decade ago now. One of the things that I noticed when I was transcribing my data was that these women, and I studied Black professional women for my dissertation research, were using a language style with me that I was familiar with, but surprised by because of its colloquial nature, right? Essentially, we were um, we were using a lot of African American English vernacular slang, and you don't generally see that in these sort of professional interview situations. And so I make an argument that because we share an identity in an area, Minneapolis, where not many people have that same identity, these women were willing to engage with me on a linguistic level that they might not otherwise, and that shaped and changed my dissertation data in ways that I wasn't necessarily prepared for. So something to consider is how you, as the individual scientist, fit into these spaces where you are collecting data. Okay, let's talk about the interview process. So, um, how do we actually go out and do this? Before we actually ever talk to anybody, we need to pick a place to do the interview, to collect the data. You want to pick somewhere quiet, probably somewhere mostly public. People get very um, concerned behind closed doors, locked doors with strangers. In COVID, I would imagine most of these things are going to happen via Zoom or Skype or FaceTime anyway. But in the eventuality of being back out in the world, setting is really important and sort of sets the stage for how well the interview goes. Um, you want to make sure that you explain very explicitly what the purpose of the research is, what the process of data collection is, what the process of what's the word that I'm looking for? Anonymity and confidentiality. What is the process for that? You want to make sure that your participants have all of the pertinent information before the interview starts, because you would hate for them to try to stop the interview midway because something comes up that they weren't expecting. You want to go over the consent process and make sure that you have your participants sign a consent form before the interview begins. I like to do that right before so that there is no confusion about willingness to participate. You want to make sure that you exchange contact info with your participants so that you can reach out to them with additional questions or clarifications as you start to analyze the data. You want to leave space for your participant to ask any final questions or to raise any final concerns about their participation. Again, this protects you as the researcher and your time just as much as theirs. And then lastly, you want to make sure that you have the appropriate materials to collect the data. Recording device, make sure it's on, double check to make sure it's on. You also probably want to supplement with a notepad and a pen. Okay, during the interview process, you want to be sure that you are extremely knowledgeable about the topic. So if they ask a question, while it's perfectly okay to say, I don't know, you'd hate to be in that position because you're trying to perform this role of prepared scientist to alleviate the stress and the worry of your participant. You'll get better data. You want to make sure that your interview is well structured. And even if you're talking about informal interviews, you again you want to come off as though you can move seamlessly from topic to topic and question to question, whether you've pre-created those questions or not. Again, this creates better data. Um, you want to make sure that your questions are clear. Writing interview questions is just as difficult as writing survey questions, although because you have the ability to probe and ask follow-up questions, you aren't beholden to that one question, but you'd hate to have to stop an interview because a participant doesn't understand the question that you're asking and you can't easily reword it for them. You want to make sure that while you are being gentle with them and paying attention to any emotional or psychological triggers that you see as the interview progresses, you also want to make sure that you maintain control of the interview and that you are steering it in the way that best helps you answer your research questions. Often, if interviews become too conversational, and you sort of forget that you're in scientist mode and not, friend mode, you may sort of lose control of the topical focus, and that will hamper your data. You want to make sure that you're being critical of what the participants are saying. If something feels off, ask another question. People lie, especially about sensitive topics, and your job as the scientist is to get as much of uh, a description of their lived experiences that feels as real and true as possible. And so, critically thinking about their answers in relation to one another, in relation to the questions that you've asked, is really important. Um, and then lastly, you want to, and this is why you want to have sort of multiple note taking approaches. You want to be able to remember and recall the things that your participant has said, perhaps to ask a probing question, perhaps to ask an additional question after the fact. When you are starting to interpret the things that they're saying and what that means for the social world at large. Okay, so when you're coming up with interview schedules, remember that list of structured interview questions that you plan to ask. You think about three different types of questions. So, behavioral questions. How did a person behave, or how do they perceive themselves to be behaving? And I should say, when we're talking about interviews and interview questions, these questions are really getting at how your participant perceives the answer to that question. You don't know if things are true or real, which is why you need to be hypercritical, but also understanding that methodologically, what interviews tell us are about the perceptions of an individual, not necessarily what actually took place. Which leads us to second type of question for your interviews, which are thoughts and feelings questions. What did you think about a particular issue? How did you feel when that thing happened to you? And then lastly, setting questions. So what happened? When did it happen? Where did it happen? Why did it happen? And using those to sort of paint a picture of the world in which these behaviors and thoughts and feelings are taking place. Most interview schedules include all three types of those sorts of questions. When you're putting your interview schedule together, order matters. You don't want to jump out the gate with some really sensitive probing question before you have developed a rapport with your participant. I like to start out with easy demographic questions. Where are you from? What year in college are you? Those sorts of things before you start asking them more personal types of questions. And then closing with maybe the most complex of the questions that you're asking. So there's a progression across the interview schedule. Um, Here, I just have a checklist, and some of this is stuff that I've already said, but I want you to be able to come back and refer to it when you're practicing interviewing, which is what we'll be doing for our active learning exercise today. There's a during and after checklist. As interviewing is a lot about muscle memory. So you'll use these checklists at the beginning as you practice, but they'll start to become second nature to you if you continue on in the social sciences. Okay, lastly, how do we transform this interview data into arguments about social life? And that is the process of analysis, right? So we are looking for patterns. So what you're going to do is after you have collected the data, you're going to transcribe it. That's the worst part about interviewing is transcribing, actually. Essentially means typing out the entire conversation that you've had into a Word document so that you can better see the words and find the patterns. Then you go through all of those interviews and you look for commonalities. Where do you see patterns in the way that they responded to behavioral questions, to thoughts and feelings questions, to setting questions? And then how does that help you answer your original research question about social life? Okay, so I said that most of this is about muscle memory, which means I'm going to ask you to try to do some of this. And you're going to have 2 weeks to do this. We won't talk about this for 2 weeks in class because this week we have our guest speakers and we won't have the opportunity to talk about it. But next week we will start with this. So, what I want you to do is come up with a very small research question, small and specific, and it can be insignificant. It doesn't have to be about some deep social problem. This is just about practicing the method. Using that research question, I want you to come up with a 4-question interview schedule, and it can be any mix of behavioral thoughts and feelings and setting questions dependent on what your research question is. I want you to use that interview schedule to interview 3 to 4 people. Please do this safely, social distanced, with masks or online or with people that are already in your home if you can. You could also do it over the phone if you wanted to. And then I want you to you don't necessarily have to transcribe the whole thing, but I want you to listen to it and look at your notes at least multiple times and identify some patterns that you see from those interviews. And then lastly, how do those patterns help you answer the research question that you came up with in the beginning? So work on that. And we'll talk this week with our guest speakers and we'll talk about your active learning exercise in 2 weeks. I'll see you then.